So hello and welcome to this current section, which is the second last section in minor piece play. And we are now dealing with the advantage of the bishop pair and how to exploit this effectively. We'll be spending a little bit of time on this section covering 3 games, beginning with the game between Salomon Floor and Mikhail Botvinnik, played all the way back in 1933. Mikhail Botvinnik, a former world champion, and Floor, one of the best players of his time. And after this, we will show a third and final game, which actually is going to be a game that I played because it came to mind and I thought it was quite an instructive use of the bishop pair. So I wanted to show that game as well. After this, we will only have one more topic to cover in the entire section of minor piece play, and that is how to improve a minor piece. But that itself will be a shorter topic. So this, I think, is the more important of the remaining topics for sure. So let us begin. So one thing that you're going to see across the games that will be shown is that in chess, very often there exist many openings and many variations within openings where you get a situation such as this one. In an Nimzo-Indian, you get the following situation in this particular line. Here, white plays the move a3 and black, in fact, captures on c3. In fact, already this move knight a6 is more or less an indicator that black will play bishop takes c3, because if he wishes to play the bishop back to capture the pawn on c5, he can do so right away. To play knight a6, the idea is that this knight is going to eventually post itself on c5, and so after a3 it's logical to give up the bishop pair. Queen takes c3 and knight takes c5. And so this brings me to the first point that I want to make, which is, giving up the bishop pair is a perfectly reasonable thing to do if in exchange you get some other benefit. What has black gotten in exchange? Well, we can say that black has a lead in development. He has 2 minor pieces out of the board, and he is able to castle on the next move. And on the other hand, white has still his kingside minor pieces undeveloped, and his queen is the only piece that is actually developed, but even the queen may be an easy target, potentially with some knight e4 ideas, or if a pawn reaches d5, you never know, it might reach d4 or even knight a4. Speaking of knight a4, we can identify a4 and b3 as potential weaknesses in the white queenside position. And we can also note that on d5 and e4, black has excellent potential to play along those light central squares in the future. So in a nutshell, we would say that white has been given the bishop pair, but in exchange, black has lead in development and some dynamic play against the white queenside weaknesses, and also some strong play in the light squares of the center. However, one thing that is very, very important, this is, I guess, the first big point to keep in mind, is when you have the bishop pair, it's a long-term advantage. And if a smart, strong opponent is giving you that bishop pair voluntarily, then for the most part they are getting something in return. In this case, we've already described what black is getting in return. So what we should cultivate is a sort of a mindset of, well, let's try and neutralize whatever benefits black has gotten. And if we can do so, then short of losing the bishop pair, that's a long-term advantage. It's not going to go away. Especially it will not go away on this board. And the reason for this is because we notice that if we take, the starting position and we were to outline the light squared pawns, we would outline as follows, and the dark squared pawns as follows. And so you see black is missing a dark squared pawn here and has advanced the e7 pawn, originally a dark squared pawn, onto this light square of e6. The consequence of this is that there are some weak dark squares, and even c5 and e5 are a little bit more vulnerable than they could be. And this, therefore, is actually tied in with this point that the bishop pair advantage is not going to go away anytime soon, because this unopposed bishop, I say unopposed because both sides have this light squared bishop on the board, this unopposed bishop is going to be especially effective, since black does not have, its counterpart to challenge it along those dark squares. And combined with the weaknesses in the dark squares, which are there more or less to stay, that advantage of this unopposed bishop, which is coming together with the bishop pair, that's going to be effective over the course of the middle game and probably over the course of the end game as well. So what white simply needs to do is complete his development and make sure that black doesn't convert his short-term advantages into anything long-term, anything tangible, while white is trying to sort of consolidate his bishop pair advantage and sort of get his king to safety. So in this case, Floor actually succeeds after a sequence of moves. By the way, notice what Botvinnik does. He posts his pawns, he shifts them over from d7 and e6, one square forward, because he's aware that in terms of the pieces that he has, in the absence of the dark squared bishop, he cannot control dark squares very effectively. So he posts his pawns on dark squares to structurally increase his control of that color complex. However, the problem with that is that on the one hand, it's very effective at controlling dark squares, but on the other, you post your pawns on dark squares and they can make easier targets potentially. Let's fast forward a whole bunch of moves now. We see that white is gradually completing his development, and so black has not really been successful in using his developmental lead. And also another thing to be considered is that when black posted his pawns on d6 and e5, he created this square, very readily available square. He voluntarily accepted a backward pawn on d6, and he created this available square on d5 for a knight to jump into. And after rook c1, knight cd7, queen d2, queen b8, knight d5, Solomon Floor does indeed take advantage of that square. Now, because of the lack of space, black is unable to capture knight takes d5, because after c takes d5, the bishop would have no moves. And the knight on d5 is a very strong piece, so black actually gave up his second bishop. Bishop takes d5, c takes d5. And, well, now we've arrived at this position where white is having the two bishops, in this case against the two knights. I should say that that's not what we're focused on, even though in this game and the next game, such a distribution arises, but you can also have a bishop-bishop-knight versus bishop-knight-knight, as we had a second ago. You can have this situation, two bishops versus two knights, or two bishops versus a bishop and a knight. I would say that on average, this situation is most effective, but it depends on the specifics of a position, so I wouldn't pay too much attention to that. Rook takes c1, queen takes c1, queen d8, castle, rook c8, and queen d2. So the dust has settled. White has by now certainly consolidated his two bishop advantage, and he's also picked up space in the process in the center, which is going to further cramp the black position. How we should play against knights as a general rule is to fight, try and restrict it from accessing important squares and from moving forward in the position. So as you can see, this knight is very much restricted. Its only forward jump would be this lateral jump, and even there g3 would take away the knight's intended target and the knight would just be looking silly on h5. This knight, on the other hand, we can say it could go to b6, but that would likely be met by b3, which would kill off any future jumps, and then the knight would just be sitting duck here, being eyed up by the bishop and tying down the black queen. And black could instead jump the knight to c5, but again there, these two squares d3 and e4 are well covered, and b3 and a4 can be covered, perhaps even immediately after knight c4, bishop to d1, if white assesses those as dangerous jumps. So the bishops and the pawn structure with the space advantage, everything is working very well to restrict those knights. Another thing that is very important to note is knights want stability. They want central outposts that are stable. If, for example, this knight were already on d4 and black had, a second pawn here supporting, let's say, then we would not speak of any kind of bishop pair advantage, because a central knight like that is a very powerful piece. As a general rule, a central stable knight will compensate for the bishop pair. But again, that's a rule of thumb and not one without exceptions. Black went queen c7, rook c1 was played. Queen takes c1, queen takes, rook takes, bishop takes c1. So a variety of exchanges, king f8 and now king f2, king e7, bishop e3, king d8 and king e1. So there are two sources for white's advantage, as already stated. Number one is the bishop pair, that's the major advantage. And actually also quite important is this central space advantage. However, note that the central space advantage, that arose from, in this position here, white jumping the knight to d5, and note that the possibility of jumping a knight to that d5 square that was completely available occurred when a few moves previously, let's take this position right here, where black played the move e5. And again, recall that black played the move e5 in order to try and fight against the effectiveness of this unopposed dark squared bishop, which is unopposed because black lost his own bishop, conceding the bishop pair. So there is a causal relationship going on there. And we cannot say that the space advantage that white enjoys in this endgame that we're examining, it would be unfair to say that that has no link to the concession of the bishop pair. Okay, so black now plays knight c5, b4, knight cd7, and g3. Notice we mentioned this earlier about some possibilities if the knight jumps to h5. The pawn here is working very well. These pawns here on dark squares, these pawns on light squares, coordinating very well. b4 has been played to take away one of the more central options for the black knight. Knight goes to b6, and now king c2. The king may even arrive on b3 and start advancing this pawn and further deprive the black knights of squares. Now the black knight stepped back immediately, so a4 was possible without the support of the king. Knight went to b6. And notice, by the way, how such a great player as Botvinnik is simply shuffling his pieces back and forth. I'm sure he was not happy about the situation, but the point is that black simply has no active plan. White has all the space. He is even currently grabbing more space on the queen side, and he has the bishop pair. And black has nothing really to play for, because the only thing that he might play for is some kind of a pawn break, but the pawn break that is visible in this position is, a supported f5 push. That's going to be very, very difficult and generally not desirable, because if you open up the position, you're likely to favor white, since he has the bishop pair and bishops thrive on open positions. So black is simply just sitting back and hoping that white cannot make too much progress. White reroutes his bishop, patiently playing, and now drives his king over to e3. And we can see that white's play, both the rerouting of the bishop to b2 and the king on e3, is designed at opening up the position somewhat and advancing that f pawn. King e7, bishop to f1, very patient maneuvering for now. The bishop on f1 stands a little bit better because not only is it controlling this diagonal, but it can also shift forward onto the h3 to c8 diagonal. Knight b5, h4. And notice this relationship between the bishop and the knight. It's a very important relationship. Two squares, either on rank or file, separate the bishop from the knight, and the bishop as a consequence is dominating the knight. Notice that the bishop controls all of the forward jumps of the knight. So very important to be aware of that. The knight just jumps back, and bishop to h3. Botvinnik keeps shuffling. f4, f6, and bishop f5. Bishop f5 is a nice little idea. The point is that the pawn on h7 is now under attack, and if you play h6 in this position, so then the light squares will become quite weak, and the pawn on h6 also can potentially be targeted more quickly down the road with g4, g5. And if you play the natural move g6, then white simply drops his bishop back. And the argument is that this pawn here on g6 is more vulnerable to an assault in the future. Black played h6. He's trying to kind of keep the position locked up, and in the event of something like f5, he will play g5 and argue that white is unable to break through, or at least he will try to prove that. White played bishop c1, no need to close the position with f5. Knight went to g7, and now f takes e5. D takes e5, and we see one of the problems of this g6 move followed by h6, which is that this is now weak, and it's being x-rayed by the white dark squared bishop. King f3 is played, h5, bishop to e3, king to d6. Notice how the bishops are just maneuvering so gracefully around the board, whereas this knight has almost no options. It can only go back, and this knight once again has almost no options either. It can once again only go back. So it's really, really beautiful, and the black position is starting to feel almost paralyzed. Bishop h6, knight e8, and opening up some more lines and potential weaknesses. g4 is a good move. Now if, for example, black were to sit around and do nothing, then after this exchange, this pawn would be a very easy target. Bishop f5 and bishop to g6 would arrive sooner or later. And notice that amazing mobility of the white pieces. For instance, the bishop goes on f5, but were this knight to move, if after, let's say, bishop f5, knight to b8, white could play bishop to g6 and hound the pawn on h5, collect that pawn, but he could also consider bishop to c8, going after the pawn on b7. And this is really a great power of the bishop pair over the knight pair, which is that knights cannot 1 second be threatening to take a pawn on h5 and the other threatening to take a pawn on b7, whereas the bishop pair absolutely can. And, funnily enough, in this position, it would be incorrect to go after either pawn, because another advantage of the bishop pair is on display, and that is their terrible offensive power. So here the move bishop to f8 would actually be checkmate. Black has run out of space, and it's very easy. For instance, most of you will know that checkmating with king and 2 bishops against king is a trivial checkmate or near trivial checkmate. It's something that beginners are taught very early on, and it's akin to checkmating with king and rook or against king, or even king and queen against king. It's quite straightforward. Whereas checkmating with king and 2 knights is nothing short of impossible. So defensive power is another advantage of the bishop pair. H takes g4, bishop takes g4, knight to c7, and bishop to e3. The bishop here is very, very effectively placed, and once again we see that checkmating idea. Were black to move his knight from d7, then bishop c5 is checkmate. Not to mention the skewer on this knight, but it won't be needed. Bishop c5 is checkmate. So now the knight on d7 is paralyzed, knight b5 was played, and king e2. The white king is simply, it's done its job on f3, it was supporting some g4 breaks, and now the king is rerouting to the d3 square. Knight c7, king to d3. Black here played the move f5, and, well, this is just lashing out. Botvinnik finally had enough, but let's take a look at a couple of sample alternatives. Number 1 is a move like knight e8, just sitting around. Well, bishop to e6, knight c7, bishop to f7, and we see that this target here on g6, it becomes a serious problem. g5 is not possible because of the excellent control that white has, so knight f8, and now bishop c5 check is picking up that knight. This time it's not checkmate, but the skewer will win the game. So therefore not knight e8. Another reasonable alternative is king e7, but this concedes the control, cedes control over the c5 square, so white can immediately exploit this with bishop c5 check. If knight takes c5, then finally white no longer has the bishop pair, but after b takes c5, these 2 pawns are far too dangerous. d6 check is too strong of a threat, and this bishop here with bishop c8 ideas about to happen is just too much. So therefore we can say that after bishop c5 check, black should play a move like king d8, but d6 is coming in anyway. Knight b5, king c4, king e8, bishop e6, check, king d5, knight b1, bishop g8, and notice how white is using his bishop pair to help him bring his king all the way up the board and convert. Black can try and hold off the king, knight f8, but in this event, then a change of pace, a change of direction, king c4, and that is once again on display the effectiveness of those bishops. Their mobility is greatly enhanced over a knight. So on the one hand, the mobility of bishops is greater than the mobility of knights. So this is especially important in a position where there are pawns on each side of the board, as in this one, and the queen and the king side, because white can leverage that enhanced mobility. The classical drawback of the bishops over the knights is that they are only able to control one set of squares, one color complex. But in this particular case, because white has both bishops, they're able to work very synergistically, and this is overwhelming those knights. Knight d2 check, king d3, knight f3, and here's the change of pace, bishop d5, going after that fixed weakness on b7. And, well, the picture says it all. The 2 bishops here on d5 and c5, centralized and harmonious, working in tandem. The knights here on f3 and f6, we cannot say the same thing, and after knight takes h4, bishop takes b7, and the a6 pawn is falling, and the a5 and b4 pawns will decide the game. So therefore, after king d3, Botvinnik played the active move f5, e takes f5, g takes f5, bishop takes f5, and now knight takes d5. So there's been a liquidation, but the problem is that white has picked up an outside passed pawn in the process, whereas black is left with his central passed pawn. And as a general rule, the outside passer is stronger than the central pawn in endgames, as king activity is very important in endgames, and this king is going to have to watch out for this pawn on h4. Of course, coupled with the bishop pair advantage, the game is simply over. Bishop to d2, not only defending the pawn on b4, but also very nice the way that, once again, that relationship is established where two squares separate the bishop and knight along either rank or file. And so the bishop here is perfectly poised to control any forward jumps of the black knight. Knight 7 f6, king c4, king c6, bishop g6, preparing to advance the pawn. b5 check, king steps back to d3. Knight e7 and bishop e4 check. Now in this particular case, white once again is offering the bishop pair, but in the event of knight takes e4, king takes e4, this pawn will decide it. The lone bishop against the lone knight, with pawns on both sides of the board, is typically also stronger. So that's another advantage of having two bishops versus two knights, which is one minor piece exchange will often be insufficient to save black. Black instead played knight ed5, but this tangles up the pieces, and we will see this once again in the next game. Bishop goes to g5, the pawn on b4 cannot be taken because of the pin. Here, black could play a move such as king to d6 to break the pin, but after bishop takes f6, knight takes f6, bishop b7, we see that problematic a-pawn once again haunting black. Therefore, after bishop to g5, black played instead knight h5, bishop f3, knight g3, bishop d2, king d6 finally breaking the pin, bishop g4, knight f6, and here, well, it was already too late, it was unavoidable, but after knight f6, bishop c8, the pawn on a6 is now coming under fire. King to c6, and here white played the move bishop to e1. Well, what can I say? As far as I can tell, bishop takes a6 was good enough to win, but I guess Floor didn't want to risk maybe his bishop getting trapped if somehow black could control that c8 square in time. I'm not really seeing what the issue was or what the fear might have been. Bishop to e1 instead was played. e4 check, king d4, knight g to h5, and notice again those knights scrambling for good coordination, for good squares, and not really creating any targets at all. And white once again, that quick change of pace seen regularly in the case of one side having the bishop pair, bishop to f5. Going after not the a6 pawn, but instead the e4 pawn, which is a cleaner win. Black played king d6, and white did not even take the pawn just yet. He improved his bishop placement, bishop to d2. The pawn on e4 will fall. The dark square bishop may land on g5 and tangle up those knights further. And it will be a trivial conversion from here. In fact, Botvinnik had seen enough and he resigned here. So I hope that this game has given you a good initial idea of how to handle the bishops and how smoothly they work together, let's say along a board where there are pawns on the queen side, on the king side, those quick changes of pace, and also the offensive possibilities. There are possibilities to weave a mating net quite easily with the bishop pair, and we saw that in a couple of the lines examined. And just the synergy between the two bishops that are able to use, by having both bishops rather than just one, you get the benefit of the mobility, the enhanced mobility of a bishop over a knight, but you also get the traditional benefit of a knight that it is able to maneuver along both squares. If you treat the bishop as a pair, then they are able to cover the entire board, and that is very difficult to handle. So with that said, let us now show the second game, which is a somewhat similar classical game, played a little bit later in 1968 with Viktor Korchnoi handling the white pieces. So let's move to that now.